that didn't look like burnout from the outside. You still smiled. You still helped people. You still played the role everyone expected. But internally, the pressure was accumulating because being highly aware of other people's emotions doesn't just create compassion, creates responsibility you never agreed to carry. And eventually, the empath reaches a threshold, the moment where absorbing everyone else's emotional chaos stops feeling like kindness and starts feeling like quiet self-eraser. This is where the transformation begins, because the empath's darkest upgrade doesn't happen when they learn to feel more. It happens when they finally stop absorbing everything around them. And most people don't realize what that shift truly means until it's already too late. The transformation doesn't begin with strength. It begins with collapse. For years, you ignored the signals your mind kept sending. The subtle discomfort when someone's words didn't match their intentions. The quiet resentment that appeared every time you gave more than you received. You noticed these things, but you overrode them because being the empath meant understanding people, not confronting them. So, when someone crossed a boundary, you explained their behavior to yourself. They're stressed. They didn't mean it. They're going through something. You kept translating their actions into reasons to stay patient. And the disturbing part is the warning signs were always there. You saw the manipulation in small moments, the passive aggression hidden behind humor, the way certain people only appeared when they needed something, but you ignored it. Not because you were blind, because acknowledging it would have forced you to change the role you were playing, and that role had already become part of your identity. The one who understands everyone, the one who stays calm, the one who absorbs the damage so no one else has to. But eventually something happens that breaks that illusion. Not a small conflict, a moment that exposes everything at once, a betrayal that feels strangely predictable, someone you defended, someone you supported, someone you protected emotionally, and when the moment came, they revealed exactly who they were: cold, self-serving, indifferent to everything you carried for them. What made it worse wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the realization that you saw it coming. The signals had been there for months, sometimes years. Your intuition warned you, your body felt it, but you overrode every instinct in order to keep the peace. That's when the real fracture happens. Not between you and them, between you and the version of yourself that kept ignoring the truth. Because in that moment, the empathize is something deeply uncomfortable. The people around you didn't just hurt you. You helped create the conditions that allowed it. You tolerated what should have been confronted. You excused what should have been challenged. You carried emotional weight that others were perfectly comfortable placing on your shoulders. And once you see that, something inside you changes permanently. The empath identity begins to crack, not because you stopped caring, because you finally saw the cost of caring without boundaries. And that realization is where the darker transformation quietly begins. This is the point where most empaths believe they simply need stronger boundaries. But what actually begins forming here is something far more unsettling. What happened to you is not random. It is a predictable psychological event. Carl Jung described this moment as the beginning of individuation, the stage where the identity you performed for others begins collapsing under the weight of reality. For most of your life, you operated through what Jung called the persona. The persona is the social mask, the version of you designed to maintain harmony, approval, and belonging. And if you were highly empathic, that persona likely became extremely refined. You learned to read emotional cues with precision. You softened your reactions. You filtered your truth so others could remain comfortable. On the surface, this looked like kindness. Psychologically, it was adaptation. Your persona became the emotional stabilizer of every environment you entered. But the more energy invested in the persona, the more something else began forming underneath it. The shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is not evil. It is simply the parts of you that were forced into hiding in order to maintain acceptance. Your anger, your refusal, your instinct to confront dishonesty, your capacity to withdraw from people who drain you. These impulses never disappeared. They were suppressed. And suppression always creates fragmentation. Fragmentation is where suffering begins. Because when one part of the psyche performs endless compassion, while another part quietly recognizes manipulation, internal tension builds. You feel it as exhaustion, but the real cause is deeper. Your conscious identity says understand everyone. Your shadow says stop tolerating them. For years the persona remained in control, but the betrayal you experienced triggered something Jung described repeatedly: the return of the shadow. The psyche can only tolerate fragmentation for so long before it begins forcing integration. And integration feels threatening because it dismantles the identity that once kept you safe. Suddenly, the empath begins experiencing impulses that feel unfamiliar. Less explaining, less emotional rescue, more observation. You start noticing how often people depend on your empathy to avoid accountability. You start recognizing the emotional transactions hidden in relationships. And most disturbing of all, you begin seeing how your own persona enabled these dynamics to continue. This is the beginning of individuation, not the peaceful version often described in self-help, the real one, where the mask begins dissolving, where the shadow stops asking for permission, and where the something that no longer functions as emotional infrastructure for everyone else. This is the stage where people around you begin feeling uneasy, because when the persona weakens, the social balance you once maintained disappears, and that's when the consequences begin. This is the phase people misunderstand the most. From the outside, it looks like you became colder, less expressive, less emotionally available, less interested in maintaining the same dynamics you once tolerated. But what actually changed was not your empathy, it was your relationship with it. For years, your empathy operated without filtration. You absorbed emotions automatically. You responded to distress before anyone even asked. Your awareness functioned like an open door. Anyone could walk through it. And most people did. Not always maliciously, but consistently. Because environments naturally adjust to the person who stabilizes them. If you absorb tension, others release it. That was the unspoken system. You carried the emotional pressure of the room so others could avoid confronting themselves. And eventually your psyche reached a limit. Not emotionally, structurally, because empathy without boundaries does something dangerous to identity. It erodes it. You slowly become defined by what others need from you, rather than what you actually are. This is where the shift begins. Not with anger, with observation. You start noticing patterns you previously ignored. Who contacts you only when something is wrong. Who becomes uncomfortable when you stop over-explaining yourself. Who subtly escalates tension the moment you stop absorbing it. The dynamic becomes visible, and visibility changes behavior. You stop reacting instantly. You pause before responding. You allow silence to exist in places where you once rushed to smooth things over to other people. This feels unfamiliar. Your calm begins replacing your emotional accessibility. And calm in this context is deeply destabilizing, because many people unconsciously rely on predictable emotional responses. They expect reassurance. They expect patience. They expect you to soften the consequences of their behavior. But now something is different. You still see what they feel. You just no longer carry it for them. That distinction is what creates the perception of coldness. But coldness is not what happened. Clarity happened. Empathy became selective. Your nervous system stopped treating every emotional signal as an obligation to respond. Instead, it began filtering. You observe more than you intervene. You listen more than you rescue. You allow people to experience the emotional outcomes of their own behavior. And this is the moment when others begin saying something unsettling about you. You've changed. They say it carefully, sometimes with confusion, sometimes with quiet accusation. What they actually mean is something else. They can no longer access you in the same way. You didn't become cruel. You became untouchable. Not because you lost empathy. Because empathy is no longer running your behavior. Awareness is. And awareness introduces a level of emotional control most people are not comfortable interacting with. Because once someone stops reacting predictably, the social scripts around them begin collapsing. People who relied on your emotional availability now experience friction. People who manipulated subtle reactions suddenly face silence instead. Your calm becomes a mirror, and mirrors make people uneasy. Because when someone cannot pull emotion from you, they are forced to confront their own. This is where isolation begins accelerating. Not because you pushed people away, because the role you once played has disappeared. And without that role, many relationships no longer know how to function. This is the phase most empaths believe is temporary. They assume they will balance out and return to who they were before. But what's actually happening is much deeper. Your psyche is reorganizing. And the next stage doesn't just change how you respond to people, it changes how people respond to your presence itself. The first transformation is subtle, but everyone feels it. You still sense emotions with the same precision as before. You can still read tension in a voice, insecurity in a pause, resentment in a smile that lasts half a second too long. Nothing about your perception weakened. What changed is your reaction. For most of your life, perception automatically triggered responsibility. If someone was uncomfortable, you adjusted. If someone was upset, you softened the situation. If someone projected frustration, you absorbed it so the room could stabilize. That reflex slowly disappears. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped translating every emotional signal into an obligation. You feel what people feel. You just don't carry it anymore. And this shift creates friction. People sense that your empathy is no longer available on command. Their frustration lingers instead of dissolving. Their discomfort remains in the room rather than disappearing inside you. The system breaks because when the empath stops absorbing pressure, the pressure has to go somewhere else, and suddenly people are forced to hold their own emotions. Most don't like that. This is when people begin saying you've changed. They're not wrong. You stopped participating in emotional rescue. You still feel everything. You just refuse to be controlled by it. That's when people begin losing their emotional leverage over you. The second transformation is where people become visibly uncomfortable because boundaries from an empath look very different than boundaries from anyone else. For years you didn't need to say no. You simply adapted yourself until conflict disappeared. You explained people's behavior for them. You rationalized disrespect so the relationship could survive. But once awareness sharpens, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. You start noticing how often patience was interpreted as permission, how often kindness quietly invited entitlement, and something inside you stops cooperating. The first change is simple. You stop explaining. You stop defending your limits. You stop justifying why something makes you uncomfortable. You stop negotiating with people who already understood the boundary they crossed. You simply withdraw access. And this silence disturbs people more than confrontation ever did. Because when someone has grown used to endless understanding, clarity feels like hostility. People who once relied on your patience suddenly accuse you of being harsh. But the truth is far simpler. You didn't become harsher. You removed the emotional buffer that once protected them from consequences. And when the buffer disappears, reality suddenly feels aggressive. At this stage, something unsettling begins happening. You start recognizing behavioral patterns almost instantly. Before, your empathy made you focus on emotions. Now your awareness begins focusing on structure. You notice who apologizes but repeats the same behavior. You notice who becomes defensive the moment accountability appears. You notice who subtly redirects conversations whenever the truth gets too close. Patterns emerge everywhere. And once your mind starts seeing patterns, it becomes very difficult to unsee them. Because manipulation is rarely loud. It's quiet. It hides inside tone shifts, half jokes, delayed responses, selective honesty. Your awareness begins connecting those signals automatically. You don't need evidence anymore. You simply observe the sequence. Behavior, reaction, repetition. And the disturbing part is how often the pattern reveals something uncomfortable. Many people are not confused. They are strategic. They test your patience. They test your boundaries. They test how much emotional weight you will continue carrying for them. When you begin recognizing these patterns, something shifts inside your nervous system. Your tolerance collapses. Not because you became cynical, because the illusion of innocence disappears. And once you see the pattern clearly, participating in it feels like self-betrayal. This is the stage where relationships start quietly dissolving. Not through conflict, through absence. You stop feeding dynamics that once depended on your emotional labor. The conversations where someone vents endlessly, but never changes. The friendships built entirely around your ability to listen. The subtle dramas that used to pull you in, because you could sense everyone's emotions. You stop entering those spaces, not dramatically. You simply stop investing energy. And the result is fascinating. Some relationships immediately collapse because without your attention stabilizing the interaction, the structure underneath becomes visible. The conversation dries up. The connection weakens. The emotional dependency reveals itself. People often interpret this as distance. They assume you're pulling away because you're hurt or angry, but the truth is quieter. You just stopped participating in systems that required you to disappear for them to function. Once your energy leaves those systems, they cannot sustain themselves, and the silence that follows reveals something many empaths struggle to accept. Some relationships only existed because you were holding them together. As the transformation deepens, another shift becomes noticeable. You talk less, not because you have nothing to say, because you no longer feel the need to fill space. For most of your life, silence felt dangerous. Silence meant tension. Silence meant someone might feel uncomfortable. So, you learned to stabilize moments with conversation, reassurance, explanation. But now silence becomes neutral, even useful. You allow pauses to exist without rushing to repair them. You let people reveal themselves instead of guiding the conversation towards safety. And something strange happens when you do this. People begin talking more around you, not because you ask them to, because silence creates pressure, and pressure makes people expose things they normally keep hidden. Your calm presence becomes a psychological mirror. People start explaining themselves unnecessarily. They start filling the quiet with details they never intended to share. Not because you interrogated them, because you stopped interrupting their own behavior. This is when people begin calling you intimidating. But intimidation is not the right word. What they're experiencing is the absence of emotional distraction. And when distractions disappear, reality becomes harder to avoid. The final transformation is the most misunderstood. You do not lose empathy. You reclaim control over where it goes. For years, your empathy was universal. Anyone could access it. Strangers, friends, people who repeatedly drained you without contributing anything meaningful in return. Your nervous system responded automatically. Now it doesn't. You still feel people deeply, but awareness begins filtering your response. You notice who shows accountability. You notice who respects your boundaries without negotiation. You notice who reciprocates emotional honesty rather than consuming it. These people receive your empathy. Everyone else receives observation. And this distinction changes the entire structure of your relationships. Because when empathy becomes selective, emotional access becomes earned. Many people interpret this as distance. But what they're actually encountering is something they'd never experienced from you before. Standards. Not everyone is allowed into your psychological space anymore. Not everyone receives your patience. Not everyone receives the emotional generosity you once gave freely. And the moment this boundary solidifies, something becomes very clear. Your empathy didn't disappear. It became protected. And protection changes the way power moves around you. The shift doesn't stay inside your mind. It starts showing up in places where people expect the old version of you. The workplace is usually the first environment where the change becomes visible. You stop volunteering for emotional labor no one else wants. You stop smoothing over tension between coworkers. You stop pretending that passive-aggressive behavior is simply stress. Instead, you observe. You answer directly. You keep conversations short. You stop absorbing the emotional atmosphere of the office. And suddenly, something strange happens. People who once leaned on your patience start becoming uneasy around you. Not because you attacked them, because the buffer is gone. The room now has to hold its own tension. And without the empath stabilizing it, the real dynamic starts surfacing. The same shift begins appearing inside your family. For years, you were the emotional translator. You understood everyone's perspective. You calmed arguments. You carried the invisible weight of maintaining peace. Then something changes. You stop explaining people to each other. You stop fixing problems that were never yours to solve. When someone crosses a boundary, you don't debate it anymore. You simply step back. This is where family members often react the strongest. Because systems built on emotional overgiving do not adapt easily when the giver stops. Suddenly, you're called distant, difficult, different. But the most dramatic shift usually appears in romantic relationships. You begin noticing patterns you once tolerated, the emotional testing, the subtle guilt, the quiet attempts to pull reactions from you. And instead of explaining yourself, you go calm, not passive, controlled. You listen more. You reveal less. You stop chasing clarity in conversations designed to confuse you. And something fascinating happens. The moment you stop feeding the emotional dynamic, The structure of the relationship becomes visible. Some partners step forward and meet you at this new level of honesty. Others slowly lose their grip. Because when empathy stops being automatic, access to you changes, and many people only realize how much emotional control they had over you the moment it disappears. What people call your coldness is not emotional decay, it is psychological completion. The empath who reaches this stage has not lost feeling. They have stopped outsourcing their identity to the emotional demands of everyone around them. The nervous system is no longer reacting automatically, it is choosing, and that choice changes everything. Your calm is no longer an attempt to stabilize other people. It is the natural state of someone who no longer needs constant emotional negotiation to exist. Inside a room. This is the stage Jung described as individuation. When the fragmented pieces of the psyche stop fighting for control, the personas no longer performs endless understanding. The shadow no longer waits underground, resentful and suppressed. Both become integrated. You can feel deeply without surrendering authority over yourself. You can observe manipulation without needing to confront it theatrically. You can step away from people without explaining the entire psychological history behind the decision. Your silence becomes sufficient. And this is why many people begin experiencing you as unreachable, not because you closed yourself off, because your emotional center is no longer accessible through pressure, guilt, or expectation. Where people once found endless accommodation, they now encounter stillness. Where they once found explanation, they now encounter boundaries. Where they once found emotional absorption, they now encounter presence, calm, unmoved. This is the empath's final form, not cruel, not detached from humanity, simply no longer controlled by it. You still feel the world, you just refuse to disappear inside it. But this transformation comes with a cost most people never mention. Awareness does not only sharpen perception, it reduces compatibility. The moment you stop absorbing emotional chaos, certain relationships begin collapsing. Quietly, people who once felt comfortable around you start feeling watched even when you say nothing. Not because you judge them, because your presence no longer participates in their illusions. And most social environments depend on those illusions to function, so distance grows. Friends who once relied on your patience become defensive. Family members interpret your boundaries as coldness. Some people simply disappear once they realize they can no longer reach you the same way. This is the quiet consequence of higher awareness. You begin seeing through dynamics that others still depend on. And once you see them clearly, pretending becomes exhausting. This is why the empath's final transformation often looks like isolation. Not because you rejected people, because fewer and fewer people can exist comfortably around someone who no longer plays the role they expect. At first, it feels like you lost something, the warmth you once gave freely, the openness that made people feel instantly safe around you, the willingness to bend your boundaries just to preserve connection. From the outside, it may even look like something inside you hardened, but that interpretation misses what actually happened. You didn't lose your empathy, you reclaimed your center. For years, pieces of you were scattered across other people's expectations. Your patience here, your understanding there, your silence wherever conflict appeared. You were fragmented, helpful, understanding, accepted, but fragmented. What Jung called individuation is not the process of becoming nicer, calmer, or more spiritual. It is the process of becoming whole. The persona that kept everyone comfortable loses control. The shadow that carried your suppressed truth stops hiding. And when those parts finally integrate, something stabilizes inside you. Not detachment, authority. You can feel the world without dissolving inside it. You can walk away without needing permission. You can exist without negotiating your identity in every room you enter. This is not emotional loss. This is psychological alignment. You didn't lose yourself. You stopped dividing yourself to survive. Most people will hear this and dismiss it, because recognizing these patterns means confronting the roles they still depend on. But if this felt familiar, if you've already experienced this shift, then you know this transformation doesn't announce itself loudly. It happens quietly, one realization at a time. If you've reached this stage, comment, "I am the final," and subscribe if you've done being the version of yourself that existed only to make others comfortable.